14,000 feet of empty air on one side, a sheer green cliff on the other, and between them, a wall. Put your hand flat against it, and you will feel something your brain refuses to accept. There is no gap.
No mortar.
No seam wide enough to slide a fingernail into. Blocks of granite that weigh as much as a delivery truck sit stacked against each other so tightly that for 500 years, through earthquake after earthquake, they have never once shifted out of place. Somebody did this by hand, on top of a mountain, without iron tools, without wheels, without a single sheet of paper to write down how. And the strangest part of the story isn't the wall itself. It's what happens when you actually go looking for how it was done, because the answer that's been sitting in plain sight this whole time is stranger and far more human than any conspiracy theory could invent. Machu Picchu was built in the middle of the 1400s, most likely under the Inca ruler Pachacuti, as a royal estate and religious retreat tucked into a saddle between two peaks above the Urubamba River. That much isn't in dispute. What draws people in decade after decade is the stonework. Walk through the site, and you'll notice something almost immediately. Not all the walls look the same. Some sections are ordinary field stone, roughly shaped, held together with mud mortar, the kind of construction crew you'd expect from any large empire on a deadline. And then there are the other walls, the Temple of the Sun, the royal sector, the great terraces below the main plaza. Here the blocks aren't rectangular at all. They're polygonal, some with a dozen distinct angled faces, curved at the edges, fitted together like pieces of a puzzle carved from a single idea. No two stones are the same shape, and yet every single one meets its neighbor with a precision that looks, at first glance, almost impossible. For a long time, people's instinct was to reach for something outside the ordinary to explain it. Lost technology. Forgotten machines. A civilization that came before and vanished, leaving only its stones behind as a kind of message. It's a compelling story, and it makes for great television. It is also, as far as the actual physical evidence goes, not what happened. And once you understand what the Inca were actually doing on that mountainside, the real explanation turns out to be more impressive, not less. Start with the quarries. Archaeologists have found them right on site, sometimes only a few hundred meters from the finished walls. Scattered around these quarries are half-shaped blocks, abandoned mid-process, along with thousands of fist-sized hammerstones made of an even harder rock than the granite being worked. These hammerstones show the wear patterns of exactly the kind of use you'd expect: repeated, controlled pounding. The Inca didn't cut stone the way we imagine cutting today, with a blade slicing through material in one motion. They pulverized it, a few grains at a time, striking the surface over and over until the rock face slowly gave way, first with heavier stones to rough out the shape, then with progressively smaller ones to refine it. It is unbelievably slow work. It is also completely sufficient, given enough time and enough hands, to produce exactly the kind of surface you see on those famous walls. The fitting process is where the real ingenuity shows up. Builders would shape one block, then hoist its neighbor into place above or beside it, over and over, checking the contact points, lowering it, marking where the surfaces touched, then pulling it back out to grind down the high spots. This is called pecking and testing, and experimental archaeologists have actually reproduced it. Teams working with period-accurate stone tools and Andean quarry techniques have shaped and fitted blocks that approach the same tolerances found at Machu Picchu, and they've done it without a single piece of modern equipment. It takes patience most of us can barely imagine, crews working for months on a single joint, but patience was not in short supply in an empire that could mobilize tens of thousands of laborers under a system of mandatory rotational labor called mita. What looks superhuman from a distance turns out up close to be an enormous, coordinated act of ordinary human persistence. But why bother with all that effort in the first place? Why not just build with rectangular blocks and mortar, the way builders elsewhere in the world so often did? This is where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because the Inca weren't just showing off. They were solving a problem. The Andes sit on one of the most seismically active stretches of the planet, right where the Nazca Plate grinds beneath the South American plate. Earthquakes here aren't rare events. They're a matter of when, not if. Rigid, mortared walls crack under that kind of stress and eventually come down. But a wall built from irregular, interlocking stones behaves differently. When the ground shakes, the blocks can move slightly against each other, absorbing and dispersing the energy instead of resisting it head-on, then settle back into place once the shaking stops. Engineers who have studied Inca construction describe this as an early, intuitive form of what we now call seismic base isolation, the same basic principle used in modern buildings designed to survive major quakes. The polygonal shapes with their curved, interlocking edges aren't decorative flourishes. They're load-bearing puzzle pieces, engineered by trial and error over generations to keep a city standing on top of an active fault line. And the visible walls are only part of the achievement. Underneath the plazas and terraces at Machu Picchu sits a buried infrastructure most visitors never think about. Layered drainage channels packed with crushed stone and gravel, engineered to carry off the enormous rainfall the site receives, sometimes more than a meter of rain in a single year. Without that hidden system, the whole mountainside would erode and slump within a few rainy seasons. Some estimates suggest well over half the total labor that went into building Machu Picchu is invisible, buried in the ground, doing work no tourist will ever see or photograph. That's not the signature of a culture obsessed with appearances. It's the signature of a culture that understood, in very practical terms, exactly what it would take to keep a city alive on a mountain that did not want it there. None of this means Machu Picchu has given up all its secrets. Genuine, honest, open questions remain, and they're arguably more interesting than any manufactured mystery. Historians still debate exactly what the site was for. The most widely supported idea is that it functioned as a royal estate for Pachacuti and his family, part retreat, part religious center, used seasonally rather than as a permanent city. But the Inca left no written language behind, no inscriptions carved into those famous walls explaining their purpose. So much of what we know comes from a patchwork of Spanish colonial records, written decades after the fact by outsiders who often misunderstood or distorted what they were told, combined with the physical evidence archaeologists have painstakingly pulled from the ground ever since Hiram Bingham brought international attention to the site in 1911. We don't know precisely how many people lived there year-round. We don't have a complete account of how labor was organized on this specific project, though we know the broader metasystem that built it. We don't know exactly why some structures were left unfinished when the Spanish arrived and the site was abandoned. These aren't gaps that require inventing a lost civilization to fill. They're the ordinary, honest limits of archaeology working with an incomplete record, and researchers are still filling them in, piece by piece, through new excavations and better analysis of existing materials. It's worth pausing on why the more sensational version of this story is so appealing, because that pull is real and it's worth understanding rather than dismissing. There's something deeply uncomfortable about admitting that people 500 years ago, without metal tools or wheeled vehicles, built something that still humbles our modern engineers. It feels almost easier to imagine a hidden precursor civilization handed them the answer than to sit with the fact that human beings, organized well and given enough time, are simply capable of extraordinary things. But that discomfort says more about our assumptions than it does about the Inca. The historical and archaeological record, the quarries, the abandoned blocks, the hammerstones, the experimental reconstructions that have reproduced these techniques, all points in one direction. This wasn't inherited from someone else. It was built, block by patient block, by a civilization that fully understood what it was doing and why. That doesn't make Machu Picchu any less astonishing. If anything, it makes it more so. Somewhere on that mountainside, master stonemasons developed and refined a building technique specifically suited to earthquakes, tested it, improved it across generations, and applied it with a level of consistency that still impresses engineers using laser scanners and computer models today. They did this while managing a labor force pulled from across an empire that stretched along the length of an entire continent, coordinating food, shelter, and supplies for workers at extreme altitude, all without the wheel, without iron, without a written language to pass instructions down on paper. The wall that stops your fingernail cold isn't evidence of something that came before the Inca. It's evidence of exactly how capable the Inca were. So the next time you see a video or an article claiming some algorithm has just uncovered a hidden, forgotten civilization buried beneath Machu Picchu's foundations, it's worth asking a simple question. What's the actual, checkable evidence behind that claim? And has anyone been able to reproduce it? Real archaeology tends to be slower and less dramatic than that, built from quarry surveys, tool wear analysis, radiocarbon dates, and painstaking excavation rather than a single dramatic reveal. It rewards patience in exactly the way the walls themselves do. And when you actually follow that evidence all the way down, what you find isn't a mystery erased. It's a mystery answered with something even better than a lost civilization, proof of what people, working together with nothing but stone, muscle, and generations of accumulated knowledge, could build on the edge of the sky. If you want to see the real quarries, the abandoned half-carved blocks, and the actual tool marks archaeologists used to piece the story together, stick around, because that's exactly where we're headed next.